To this point, we have learned about basic CSS selectors. We've talked about type selectors, we've talked about class selectors, as well as ID selectors, and then we moved on to combinators. Now, CSS also provides us what we call pseudo classes, and these pseudo classes are kind of complex combinators that create selectors for us that are built into CSS. In other words, instead of building our own complex combinators with all of the basic selectors, we have some pre-built ones for us that are in the form of pseudo classes. Now we can recognize a pseudo class based on the colon that sits in front of the selector. And in fact, throughout all of our examples, we've actually already used one of the pseudo classes. Now, if you go to this reference here at the Mozilla Developer Network, you will see, if you go to the pseudo classes under the CSS reference, that there are about 30 plus different pseudo classes that are provided to us by the CSS standard and have been implemented in most all modern browsers. I'll leave it to you to go through and learn about all the other pseudo classes that you have available to you. And it's really important that as you are building your CSS and you run into situations where you are trying to accomplish a complex selection, that you go back to your pseudo class reference and make sure that you look through those and understand what is available so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel with complex combination selectors on your own. Go see what's already pre-built for you and use what's there instead of reinventing the wheel. We're going to cover 4 out of the 30 right here. These are some pretty, you'll probably run into these pseudo classes in CSS that you are working on, whether it be in your professional development or whether you're working on an open source project, or as you are building your own websites, you're going to run into examples on the internet when you Google how to do something in CSS. And you'll run into these particular pseudo classes frequently. So hover, we've already seen this when we created our navigation for the main navigation and we selected all of the anchor tags. We have down here the selection of anchor tags and we utilized a pseudo class without even knowing it. And we used the hover. What the hover pseudo class does is it says on any anchor tag, when we have a hover state happen, we want to change this background color to a really dark gray, almost black. And we see that when we go to our website. When we hover over our navigation, we can see that the action of hovering over this HTML element invokes the hover state. And this pseudo class that were provided by CSS takes that hover state and allows us to modify CSS properties on that HTML element as that state change happens. So this is a very useful one. You'll see it all the time on anchor tags as well as other elements. Whenever the cursor of the mouse pointer comes over the element, the hover state gets invoked, and then all of the CSS properties that you change inside of this CSS rule will then be applied to all elements selected based on the selector that you have preceding the pseudo class. And it's only when that state is invoked that you will see these changes happen. So really useful pseudo class right there is the hover. Now let's talk about the first child pseudo class. The first child allows us to select the first child element in a list of elements that we pull back based on one of our regular CSS selector queries that we use. So in this case, on our index page, we have a lot of unordered lists and ordered lists that we have that make up our web page. So right here, we've got this list right here. We've got our main navigation, and then we have another set of lists right here that we've been playing with as we've been learning CSS. So we're going to do the first child pseudo selector on the unordered list. So let's take an unordered list and let's go ahead and pull all list items that sit underneath the unordered lists that we pull back. And then let's go ahead and with our pseudo selector, let's only pull the first child from each of those lists. And then let's apply a color change to them. And as always, we're going to do a really ugly background color change so we can see the effects of this pseudo class on our list of list items coming from those unordered lists. And let's just set it to black. We should be able to see that change pretty well. So let's go in here and you'll see on the unordered list, this is an ordered list down right here, but on our unordered lists, this includes the navigation. As you can see, we've got our hover state on this contact us, but on our first item in our list, the background color is now set to black, and that is because of our first child selector. Now let's go ahead and try that on our unordered list items, and then let's change on the last child in the list of elements that we get back. And let's change that background color, and let's change, oh, background color, not clip. Let's change that color to red so we can really see what happens here. We'll see that the last list item changes to red, and you can see we still have that hover state. In reality, the hover state is still here as well. It's just, and you can barely see it. We're going from black to a really dark gray, and we still have that going on here, but you can see that the first and the last items in our lists are now colored based on this first child and last child. We could do it with complex combinators in here, but we already have this provided to us by CSS. Now let's go ahead and do the not. Now the not, we can use the wildcard, which means any element that matches this selector, and we're going to use the pseudo element not. And what not does is says any element that does not meet the selection or the selector that we put in here, and we're going to say anything that is not a p tag or paragraph tag, let's go ahead and let's set its background color. And we're going to set it to black as well. Now if we do this, we should see pretty much our entire page go black except for p tags, because anything that is not a p tag, we're going to set that background color to black. And here we can see anything that is a p tag is now has a background of black in it. Okay, so that's what the not pseudo class does, is anything that is not whatever comes back from this selection, it takes everything that is not in that selection and then applies these CSS property changes to them. Now this has messed up our web page pretty good, so we're going to go ahead and comment out these selectors right here. And then this has messed up our navigation, but we still want to see this here. So let's go ahead and let's limit it to just that particular UL that sits down here in the Getting Started section. So let's add a selection based on the title of this div like we've done in the past. And let's apply it only to that particular div. So we'll say div, oops, I wrote that backwards, div, any div with the title equal to Getting Started, then we're going to look for any list items in it, and only the first list item are we going to change. So we get back our first item in the About Us. It works good now. Then we're going to do the exact same thing down here on our last child in order to limit the effects of this to just this list down here. Now you can see our navigation is back to normal, but our list items still have the first item set to black background and the last item set to a red background. Now we can see how those work, and then we've also seen how the wildcard, which means any element, that's what the wildcard is for, and we've seen how the not works. And we've commented that out so it doesn't destroy our web page completely. Those are pseudo classes. Again, there's about 30 other ones that are provided to us inside of our CSS. So make sure you go read about each one so you know what you have available to you as you start working on your CSS in your website.